Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us again after the break. I have a great pleasure in introducing this session because when we were working on this, as to talk about how can we get engaged in the research and development of healthcare, looking at how patient engagement is there in clinical research and development of medicines, vaccines, and other health devices. We scanned around the world to look at key academic and industry experience, which can really highlight what is the issues, how that has been included, and how they have helped us to attain that patient engagement. I've today two of the best to start off with. I will start off with Dr. Nilufar Ahmed, coming from Bristol University and looking at co-production of clinical research. Dr. Ahmed is a psychologist who has been at the social sciences at Bristol University for over 20 years. She's worked in academia, third sector, inclusion of, and on the subject of inclusion of marginalized and minority communities in research and development of innovative health and social care services in Europe. Dr. Ahmed has really brought home the need in what we in the UK call the social deprived communities, social deprivation areas, and looking at the social determinants of health, and also brought or teased out great community workers and others to engage in healthcare. She has broad experience, not only experience and skills, but also the theory and knowledge from a range of areas, which really lends well to look at the social determinants of health. And they include psychology, sociology, ethnography, geography, and gender studies. Next, I've got Dr. Adeline Edgar from the Sub-Saharan area part of Novartis Global Health. And Dr. Adeline has really got that credential when we looked at her range of experience. She has been the chief scientific officer for the Sub-Saharan Africa at an innovative company. You know, if you talk about innovation, then the immediate mind comes up to looking at Novartis. This is a company that has really led the field in many things, and currently in sickle cell as well. Some of the crisis management, biotherapeutics, and others are well known now. So in Africa, we know well from the north as well, from for the companies and for thalassemias as well. And since 2012, she was in clinical practice, and then has several years of experience before she joined pharma. So this is an individual who has seen what happens on the ground and then gone upstream to change that through the industry partners. And I think this is the kind of engagement we really look at. Someone who brings in the medical affairs and experience on the ground and into health pharmaceutical company. And she has advisory board for a long time and looked at several therapeutic areas, and been working in both the English and the French-speaking Central Africa. I would now look at some of our passionate interest in vulnerable groups, especially pediatrics and children, and also looking at other areas. And I'm now going to start the session without much ado to bring in first Dr. Nilufar Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed, could you start us off and explaining what is it, this patient-centered approach to co-creation and to...
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to talk to you about some of the general themes of co-production in clinical research and also in the development of health services. It is a principle that has been developing traction in the UK for some time now, but it still remains not as well understood as we would like it to be. So I'm going to discuss some of the models of co-production, what it is, and explain how we use that and how we can apply it to our own work, and how it has a real effective power balance restoring principle to it. If we apply the principles of co-production, we can really see the evening out of power differentials. But this doesn't come easily. There are always challenges when we want to make changes to health systems, to the ways we do things. And so I'd like to address some of those as well and think about how we can work with them and not let them derail our efforts. So I have some quotes here, and essentially they all say the same thing. If you start to look at the research on co-production and what the definitions are, they tend to tell us the same thing in different words. The first definition is about the co-production of health services. So where local residents, decision makers, service users, carers, family members all come together to work together and recognize that those who make use of a service are the ones who are the experts on that service, and they will be best positioned to understand what is needed in any new service. It doesn't matter how expensive a service is, how much money has been put into it, how flashy it is. If it doesn't meet the needs of the population it's designed to serve, the service is essentially defunct. The second quote is from the National Institute of Health Research, and this talks about how we design research in that same co-productive way. And it talks about bringing together researchers, health professionals, members of the public, working together in really open, inclusive ways where that knowledge is generated, where everyone feels that they have had a share in that process. It's organic and it's representative of everyone's views. And where there are differences, people have worked together to tease out what those differences are and come to an agreement about what the data means, how they want to design studies. And so it's very much about a real sense of inclusivity, which we don't see in research. As an academic, there are very clear power differentials between academics and members of the public that continue to be in society. So here are some principles of co-production. There is no one standard model. There are lots of different principles, and I've taken these ones from the National Institute of Health Research and the Social Care Institute of Excellence. And I'll run you through this diagram quite quickly. If we start off with sharing of power, here research processes and all are jointly owned by everyone who's involved to be part of that. And this might mean that we find more creative ways of generating data, that we use different things. So working with mental health patients, looking at pictures that people might draw, poems they may write, the way that they structure their days, timelines, developing those and bringing those into the research process to understand how that can help us to assimilate that into our understanding of what data is, as opposed to very clinical understandings of data. This idea of including everyone is really important. It's easier said than done, unfortunately. What it says is that everyone who is involved has an equal contribution to make. And by reflecting on these, and part of co-production really requires a reflexive process that we engage in throughout the process, we can then see, are we actually only using some people in a tokenistic manner, just so that we can tick off a box, or are they being included in the same way that everyone else is? Respecting the knowledge of everyone that comes to the space, we know that research, health service delivery, people with lots of qualifications can have a power differential, a sense of authority and deference, and particularly when we're working with minority communities. You know, we've been taught to look up to somebody who's a doctor, who's a health professional, and they will know better than us. But actually co-production says, no, you know, we don't know better than somebody who's a patient or somebody who's a service user in a different capacity. We all bring equal amounts of knowledge to this, and we all learn from each other. Accessibility is not just about making sure that we have ramps and people can get into a space. It's about having dissemination events in different spaces in the community, that we take that research out, we take those discussions out to people. It's about budgeting for things like translators, sign language experts, all of those things. Reciprocal relationships is that everyone feels that they benefit. And if I'm not benefiting, I know that I can tell you that I'm not benefiting and I feel left out. That's a really important part of this collaborative work. Diversity is really important, that we include every voice of, not just racial diversity, but of sexual diversity, of age diversity, of health diversity as well. And that relationship building, which happens before we start the process, but will continue afterwards. If your relationship for co-production ends when you have reached your own target, then you were never interested in that co-production, because it needs to continuously evolve, any service, any research project. So I also am quite interested in developing this idea about co-production as an anti-racist process, and I will talk you through this. In the first instance, there are a couple of different things. So I will talk about the first basic level of how we've engaged with minority communities. The first one is just doing things to people. Hey, I've got a brand new service and you will be so lucky to receive this. And we have historical references here, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment in America, where it was known that African-American men had syphilis and they treated them in experimental ways. And they knew they were doing harm, but they continued to, but they pushed this message of this is a new treatment that will benefit you. I am your savior is what that's telling us. Then there is the educating you. So we look at things like the Nestle milk formula scandal, where this is better. Do you know that you could harm your baby with your own milk because it's not rich of nutrients? But if you use this, then you will be helping your family. So we come in with these tricks of education, of helping, and it's all about doing something to the community rather than involving them. The second stage is where I would say most of organizations, society is at some level. It's patient involvement. These are words that won't be unfamiliar to you. Patient consultation, engagement. And these have elements of doing for, and I'm not criticizing these, but I am saying that they are limited in some ways. Patient involvement might just be involving someone at key stages so that I can tick that little box up. If I'm consulting with you, then I've already made my decisions. I'm taking you two options. I'm saying, hey, do you think my waiting room should be in blue or yellow? What if I want green? What if I want something different, but it doesn't give me that option to talk about that, my feelings and what I think I can bring to this? And that engagement is often about, again, informing people, about telling them about things we've already decided in a space elsewhere. So this is about doing something for the community. It is useful, it listens to you, it will ask questions, and it will take some of that information to inform the process, but it will disregard anything that doesn't fit with a model we already sort of have in mind. And it can be quite tokenistic at times. Sorry. And this is the final level, the co-creation and co-production. This is what we aim for. They are related and they can sort of be enmeshed. Co-creation is, I have a new service or I have a new idea for a research project, and I'm going to bring you in right now so that we can plan it right at the start, just as we create this service. And then that goes into co-production. Co-creation, if I take your ideas and then I don't involve you in the rest of the delivery and the production, then I have done that at the start, but I'm not involving you later. Co-production you can have with an existing service. So there is a vaccination program already in place. I'm now going to open that up to produce our next stages in a more effective way with the community. And that has all of those elements that I talked about, that reciprocity of relationship, that sharing of knowledge, that equal power base. And what this is about is much more about equality. And we're doing things together. We have this platform where we recognize the expertise each party brings, but there is no hierarchy of people's skills. Everyone is known to bring something of equal value. It's much more inclusive as a process. And here are just some of the benefits of co-production, and there are many, many more. And I won't talk you through all of these, but things like creating a safe space. If I can be in a room with somebody who is much more intelligent than me, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medic, I'm a doctor of psychology. I don't know the medical language, and so I will feel slightly out of place with people who know more than I do. But if it's a truly co-produced space, I'll feel safe to say, oh, I don't really understand that, because if I don't understand that, someone else might not. So we can then create that language in a way that is much more efficient. We need to work around sort of the health literacy of the population as well. It restores those power balances. It creates resilient communities because we know that we can have these ongoing reflective encounters, that you will not produce a service or a research project and then disappear, which is what has happened to many minority communities, is that they have been harvested for their knowledge, their experience, and somebody comes and says, we'll develop a service, then they disappear. And the people who've contributed to that don't see any of those outcomes in any positive way. It's much more inclusive, and it really helps to build capacity within communities, and also that social capital that we can then use as bridging capital as well. So we can bridge from the community into academic sectors, into service provider sectors as well. And so finally, I want to talk to you about the challenges of co-production. I know that what I've just presented sounds wonderful and really utopian, and it's not easy. And no one can ever say that it is, because change is hard. You know, the way that we are currently working works very well for many, many people, particularly those who hold power. And it can exclude some people. And if we want change, we have to have people in certain spaces, particularly those at the higher end of society or occupying more high positions in the hierarchy, to be able to concede to change. They must, and not everyone is happy to do that. Collaboration will bring together all of these different perspectives. And whilst it's empowering for some, it will be disempowering for others first, because I will need to give up some power because my carers are coming in and they'll need to have some of the space that maybe I would have had. But eventually I will be empowered in the same way, because I will receive that knowledge, I will become better informed, and we will all rise together. But that is not easy to get people to be willing to give up some of their power. And then we've got the checking of power. It's really important to be mindful of the principles of inclusion. But if we're not constantly checking in with power through a reflexive process and asking people about how they feel, and if we don't feel open to share how we feel, then we end up just simply reinforcing existing power imbalances, and it becomes tokenistic all over again. And it's not co-production. So many things have co-production on the label, but when you look at the process, it's really not. And finally, understanding that this is a continuous process, that co-production has to go on beyond the end of achieving a new service or the end of the research project and a publication in a journal. For an academic, my end product is a journal article, and then I move on to my next project. That is not a respectful reciprocal relationship. There needs to be a continued engagement with those people who are part of that process. And even if I step back from that process and I take on other work, I must be there to be able to support that process as it continues to develop in different ways and offer that support. And that's what we really need to be able to do, to sort of have co-production work successfully, and then use that research to move into co-produced service delivery. And I know I've rushed through these slides very, very quickly, but I'm very happy to take any questions in a minute. So I'm going to stop sharing so that I can come and find you all again.
Thank you very much, Nilufar. Thank you, Nilufar, for this very important baseline to begin official relationships and co-production. I think you've put it rightly, so that this is about power sharing. It's about respecting autonomy and insight and valuing others' experience and perspectives. And for that, I will now go on from the other end of the spectrum to Dr. Adeline Edgar. And I think Novartis has really exemplified this in the way they structure research for co-production, co-creation, and how they engage various patients in that. I know from a personal experience that we were part of the same IMI International, the Innovative Medicines Initiative that the European Union.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Adeline Edgar, and I'm very happy to be here at the first African Patients Congress today. Just like to give a special thanks to IAPO for giving Novartis the opportunity to participate at this first Patients Congress. So yes, so we'll be talking today a little bit about clinical trials and the work we've done within clinical trials. And we will look at, why clinical trials in sub-Saharan Africa and what benefits it will make to patients. So just first of all, looking at what the Novartis commitment to patients and caregivers is. So we do have a firm commitment, working together, we can improve outcomes for patients and be a trusted partner in changing the practice of medicine. So these are our 4 pillars, respecting and understanding the patient's perspective, community perspective. In all our projects, whether it be clinical trials, whether programs or screening or awareness, we do have a commitment to get the patient's voice and the patient's perspective, and generally what the patient thinks about these things, and to get a better understanding of how we need to engage. The next pillar would be expanding access of our medicines. So we do understand in low and middle income countries, there is a challenge in being able to access medicine. So our commitment as Novartis, as a company, is to be able to expand access across, the various income pyramids to all patients. So this is another pillar of our commitment to patients and their caregivers. Conducting responsible clinical trials where we would get the insights, the understanding of patients, also raise awareness on the importance of clinical trials to patients as well. So they see us as a trusted partner, not just in medications, but in all the projects that we do, most especially in clinical trials. So this is another, the third commitment we have to patients and caregivers. And lastly, recognizing the importance of transparency and reporting, and understanding that we're a company that deals beyond the pill. We want to build trust with our patients and caregivers alike, responsibly reporting adverse events, pharmacovigilance issues, and notifying healthcare authorities about our clinical trials and how we fare with them. So yes, so that's our commitment to patients and caregivers. So what is our sub-Saharan African aspiration with regards to clinical trials? So we are on a journey. We do know that implementing or conducting human trials in Africa has been met with a number of challenges. So we would, to our mind, we have started conducting clinical trials across various countries within sub-Saharan Africa. And we have ramped up internal capabilities to enable us to conduct these clinical trials. And we've started clinical trials in certain therapeutic areas such as malaria and sickle cell disease. But where do we want to be in the coming years? We want to be able to include the diversity amongst Africans involved in clinical trials. So this is one of our key aspirations. We also want to build capabilities. We know that currently on the continent, we have clinical trials in communicable and the non-communicable diseases. So we want to build and leverage and expand our capabilities in clinical trials to include ophthalmology, oncology, and other therapeutic areas. So that's also one of our aspirations within sub-Saharan Africa. And then just giving the patient a voice to better understand what the patient's voices and perspectives are within clinical trials, getting key perspectives within the different stages of the clinical trials, whether it be the protocol or whether it be the number of visits to sites. So just getting a very, a good understanding of what the patient's needs and wants are. To do this, we look for opportunities within our robust pipeline. We have a robust pipeline of medications that we're researching. And we look towards the large burden of disease and see where this pipeline would fit in within clinical trials on the continent. So that's one way we want to get there. Another way is really to engage patients and their caregivers, like I said before, within the clinical trial space. We do hope to get more insights, more feedback. We are starting to build into our clinical trials what we call a trial feedback questionnaire, just to get, understand the patient's experience within clinical trials. And then, we're also trying to include patient-friendly or patient awareness materials on the benefits and the importance of clinical trials and why they should participate, because we know that historically there has been a lot of hesitancy regarding, participating in clinical trials. So these are some of our sub-Saharan African aspirations that we hope to be able to achieve in the coming years. So why clinical trials in Africa? So this just gives us a picture of the true size of Africa. Within Africa, we have a population of over 1 billion. That accounts for over 16% of the world population, and we have an average growth rate of about 2.5 annually. And the median age is 19.4, so we do have quite a young population. And we know that non-communicable diseases account for over 30% of deaths within Africa. And we know that non-communicable disease will be a leading cause of death on the continent by 2030. I'm still looking at non-communicable diseases, focusing on cancer as a leading cause of death within the 30 to 69 age group. We know that on the continent of Sub-Saharan Africa, this ranks between 3rd and 4th as the leading cause of death within populations in Sub-Saharan Africa. So there is, a very great need to build capabilities, most especially in the non-communicable disease, not just the non-communicable disease, but also in the oncology space as well. Still zeroing into diseases of interest, apart from oncology. Oncology actually accounts for about 6% of deaths on the continent, globally. So we're looking at cardiovascular disease, which accounts for almost 30% of deaths worldwide, which is really pretty high. And then looking at also visually impaired patients, looking at we have a 15%, which accounts for over almost 40 million patients that are visually impaired on the continent. So we can see that there are really a lot of potentials for clinical trials within this space, within these various disease areas in Sub-Saharan Africa. Still zeroing into the non-communicable diseases and looking at the mortality rates as it affects the different countries within Sub-Saharan Africa. So we can see that for Nigeria, we have about 29% of patients that actually die from non-communicable diseases, and this accounts for over 2 million deaths in the country. For Kenya is about 27%, which accounts for over 200,000 deaths. And we can see in Mauritius, mortality from non-communicable diseases is a whopping 89%. So we can see that there is, great opportunity for us to engage in clinical trials, most especially within the non-communicable disease space. So this just gives us a picture of what we need to, look at focusing on within the continent. We will say historically, most of the clinical trials that have been run in Sub-Saharan Africa or in Africa as a whole have really been in the countries of Egypt and South Africa. So that's typically where clinical trials have been held. And we do hope to ramp up capabilities, trial sites, expertise and knowledge within Sub-Saharan Africa, and not just limited to infectious diseases where the focus was, prior to now, but also expanded to other therapeutic areas that I've also spoken about. And so why now? Why in Sub-Saharan Africa? So in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have a particularly high unmet need for treatment, most especially, as alluded to before, in the non-communicable disease space. And we do have quite a bit of expertise on the continent with infectious disease. So we want to see how we can leverage on this and pave the way for non-communicable disease trials. Clinical trials will also enable us give access to innovative molecules to patients who otherwise may not have been able to get access to these innovative medicines. And then, of course, building the expertise and knowledge of healthcare providers, in managing these disease conditions can only mean, good things, improving and extending the lives of patients on the continent. So these are some of the reasons why we have a special focus on Sub-Saharan Africa. And then what are the benefits for patients? We know that historically patients have had, most especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, there's been quite a bit of hesitancy, skepticism, in participating in clinical trials. So, what would be the benefits of patients, being able to, access clinical trials and participate? First of all, it would be able to, they would be able to access a greater portfolio of innovative medicines, not just from Novartis, but from other pharma companies as well. So this would be one benefit that patients, would be able to, gain a lot from. Pharma companies in general are ethically responsible. And once they have conducted clinical trials, then they would need to have those products registered in those countries where those trials have been conducted. So this also is of great benefit to patients who may otherwise not have been able to access these drugs. And then, of course, dissemination of medical knowledge, improving medical practice. So building capabilities amongst healthcare professionals within certain therapeutic areas is also of great benefit when it comes to patient outcomes. And then looking at the data on race and ethnicity, we know that Africa is a really the homogeneity is really high. So looking at that data, looking at getting African populations included in clinical trials and seeing how, clinical trials, the outcomes actually affect Black populations and African populations would also be of benefit to many patients on the continent. So this just gives us an overview of what Novartis as a company is doing in terms of clinical trials. So I would say right now in Sub-Saharan Africa, the focus for Novartis has been in two disease areas, which is malaria and sickle cell disease. As you can see, we are conducting clinical trials in a number of countries, both within West and Central Africa and East Africa. For the malaria trials, some of them have started already and are ongoing. We also plan in the coming years to start on others. So some of those trials would be, malaria in newborn babies, in children, and looking at new ways of treating severe malaria. Okay. In the sickle cell disease space, the trials are actually all ongoing. We have those trials going on in Ghana, in Kenya, and Mauritius. So we have the STAND and STEADFAST trials for sickle cell disease. So those are trials that are also ongoing. And like I mentioned before, we do hope to expand and leverage upon these capabilities and trial sites and expertise of HCPs to expand into other areas where the disease burden is quite high. So in conclusion, I would like to say that we've in conducting clinical trials, we do have quite a large portfolio of medications that patients would have access. We do hope to be able to conduct clinical trials in a sustainable manner, ensuring that patients get access to these drugs even after the trials have concluded. And then we know that we are ramping up expertise both internally and externally to be able to conduct clinical trials successfully. So with that, I've talked today a bit about our commitment to patients and caregivers. Talked about the journey that we need to embark on, to ensure that clinical trials are conducted in a transparent manner, to the benefit of patients. We've looked at certain therapeutic areas of interest, including non-communicable diseases and the need to ramp up in other areas such as ophthalmology and oncology. And then we've looked at what the benefit of conducting clinical trials on the continent would be to patients themselves. So I would just like to say thank you to IAPO for giving us the opportunity to participate at this meeting. And and then to the patients themselves that give us our everyday inspiration within Novartis to do the kind of work that we're doing, and we hope to continue to do. So thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. So I'll hand back to the moderator, Kawaldip. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adeline. That was really good. I think you really showed the heart of Novartis and how they've logically set out the pathways clearly. And I think that's what's important. And I think we will be working very closely with yourselves, trying to bring in more patients across those unmet needs, and especially some of the diseases that are specific to Africa where we do need input. Now, for my next speaker, I've got Dr. Miriam Mutebi, but unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us due to lots of work pressure. Dr. Miriam is the assistant professor of the Department of Surgery at the Aga Khan University in Nairobi. And it's a teaching hospital and research center. And Dr. Miriam has been forefront of breast surgical oncologists and has been really running this department. And her work day in, day out involves trying to engage women patients into these aspects. As you know, there are no two cancers alike, and it is a very important part of getting them into it. And I will now ask Manish to run her recording to look at how her role of Pan-African Women's Association of Surgeons, how she's involved in that, how Miriam has led all aspects of educating women and engaging women in their own care. This is a true example of nothing about us without us. And Dr. Miriam has made sure they are all included within her practice, thought, and I would say within her classrooms when she brings in new surgeons. Thank you very much. Could you run it now, Manish?
My name is Miriam Mutebi, and I'm a breast surgical oncologist based at the Aga Khan University Hospital in Nairobi, Kenya. Today, I'm grateful for the International Alliance of Patients Organizations for an opportunity to reflect on patient engagement in clinical trials in Africa. So over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk a little about the changing demographics, talk a bit about value-based care and outcomes and their importance, and looking at the role of clinical trials in helping to complement value-based care. We'll spend a little time talking about some of the strategies for patient engagement, but also looking at this through the lens of the pandemic that has, made us question and start to critique the ways of care delivery. And I'm going to use breast cancer as a paradigm to illustrate the points I'm trying. In sub-Saharan Africa, women tend to be 10 to 15 years younger than their counterparts in the West at the time of their diagnosis. Despite increasing efforts around access, we still have the majority of our patients diagnosed with advanced stage 3 and stage 4 cancers. And this is in the background of a lack of conventional screening. However, I would say over the last 10 years, we have seen an increase in the number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa with national cancer control programs. There has been a rise for sure in cancer advocacy and awareness, meaning that we're now starting to see an increasing number of patients diagnosed with earlier cancers. And it's a consideration that we need to take into account, even as we start to think about care plans for all these different patients. If we look at the reasons why patients in sub-Saharan Africa are diagnosed with advanced cancers, but also when after their diagnosis frequently do not complete their care, what we see is a constellation of factors. One being the fact that patients have to pay out of pocket for their health care, which frequently results in catastrophic health expenditure. And this is further compounded by poor health systems. We've actually moved away from the term late presentation, because what we've realized as clinicians is that on average, a patient in sub-Saharan Africa will see 3 or 4 clinicians before a definitive diagnosis of their cancer is made, thus underscoring the need to have an informed workforce and well-educated that's able to identify signs and symptoms of cancers in a timely fashion and make appropriate referrals. One of the other factors that we don't talk about, that we may not talk about frequently, is the sociocultural barriers to care that exist. And this is because in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, women are not the primary determinants of their health-seeking behavior, and as such require either financial support or sometimes permission from a partner or a spouse in order to access care. And this is further compounded by the myths and stigma that we have around cancers, and sometimes the use of alternative therapies. What then does value-based care in sub-Saharan Africa look like? So value-based care attempts to find the balance between quality of care and cost effectiveness. As we know, cancer diagnosis and treatments are complex and expensive anywhere in the world. More so in sub-Saharan Africa, and looking at how do we provide good quality care at a rate that's not necessarily going to break the bank, but that also doesn't compromise on the quality of care. And that, again, calls into mind what are the ethics of practice, because you don't want to give suboptimal care just because you may not necessarily have the available resources. So the ethos behind this is, how do you provide the highest quality of care at a rate that is cost effective to patients? And so some of the strategies around value-based care have been attempted on the continent. We do have some examples from the West, especially looking at clinical benefits of new therapies, things like the ESMO and ASCO clinical benefit frameworks that try to look at new therapies and how beneficial they are. And we've had a couple of strategies around what could apply to sub-Saharan Africa, things like the WHO best buys, things like choosing wisely, more recently done in Africa, which are trying to look at avoiding harmful practices that may cause either financial toxicity or harm to patients, and looking at things like NCCN harmonized guidelines that try to give a framework for providing optimal care with lower. The other concept that we need to think about is endpoints. We always want to look at what are we doing and how do we measure the effectiveness or the benefit of what it is we are providing. And so we've traditionally had quite a number of, I would say, clinical related outcomes, And more recently, we're starting to come into, I think there's been an increasing appreciation for the role of patient-centered outcomes. And so from a clinical perspective, we want to see, is the chemotherapy that we're giving working? Has the tumor shrunk? But I think there has been an increasing recognition of the role for patient-reported outcomes. And this is simply to say, ensuring that the cure is not worse than the disease. And so this applies a 360 approach to look at, yes, we're giving therapies, but how are our patients tolerating them? We are giving these therapies, but what are the psychological fallout of these therapies? For instance, breast cancer surgery has the highest psychological fallout. And so how do we support patients with these diagnoses? Is it by providing, say, breast conservation services, reconstruction services, psychological support? And in sub-Saharan Africa, one of the key factors is how do we ensure financial stability for patients throughout their initial phase of treatment and beyond, such that we're actually helping to improve their quality of life and not necessarily breaking the bank? And how do we successfully reintegrate patients into their communities? A key aspect as well is shared decision making. And I think there are a couple of points that we in sub-Saharan Africa may sometimes suffer from. There has been a paternalistic approach from medicine where we sort of come down from the mountain with our 2 tablets and tell you how to take them, which is one thing that definitely needs to change. Again, we have a culture of collectivism where as a community, we have a very strong, vibrant community that provides support, but the strength can also be a weakness. For instance, sometimes I would ask a patient to, go home and decide between, does she want to have a breast conservation, meaning we remove just the tumor and preserve her breast, or a mastectomy where we remove the entire breast. And it's a highly individual decision. And sometimes it will get the community coming to say, and the clan elder saying, we have decided. Now, while we respect and appreciate the value of community, the patient always needs to be at the center of any key decision making. And so sometimes it will say, thank you, we appreciate the support, but what does the patient actually want? And it's the patient's voice that needs to resonate around the center of any key decision making. Again, we are dealing with quite a number of vulnerable populations in sub-Saharan Africa. So how do we ensure that these patients understand the therapies that we're suggesting, understand the research that we're doing, understand what the implications of care are to them? Data, there's quite a bit of data to suggest that we may be seeing different patient profiles and different patient populations. And so this perhaps has an implication on whether therapies from the West will automatically work in our population. It's definitely, just to give you an example, we've done part of the team at my hospital, along with collaborators internationally, did try and look at the triple negative genetics. They just did a genetic study on breast cancer specimens among Kenyan, African American, and Caucasian women. And I don't expect you to interpret the mosaic, but what I want us to appreciate is just looking at the genes that are upregulated, you tend to see the Kenyan population is the pattern in the middle. To your right is the African Americans, who sometimes are frequently used as a proxy for people of African ancestry, and you can see there's clear differences between that pattern and the pattern of the Kenyan population. And also looking to the left at the Caucasian population, one sees a difference in the pattern of genes discovered. Again, looking at genes that are downregulated in this triple negative breast cancers, again, we can clearly see clear differences between the Kenyan population and the Caucasian and African American populations, suggesting that even the therapies that we give may behave a little differently in these three different populations, thus underscoring the need to have more studies around our populations in Africa.
Thank you very much, Manish. We will try to get this presentation fully loaded up into our website and have that there. Before I go on to my very sacred duty of introducing Manase Tedese from Ethiopia, who's been working at Viatris as a president for the emerging markets, I just want to have a brief discussion with the two presenters who are live with us and ask two questions to you. What do you think, firstly to Dr. Nilufar, who has vast experience of working with the African diaspora in London and Europe as a whole, what do you think the role of power sharing is? As you saw, Dr. Miriam talked about the family-owned diagnosis, whereby there is a paternalism. Do you think there's a way to get around this to actually ask the patient to engage in research and development?
I think that's at the heart of co-production, is that we involve whoever the patient finds important to involve. So we see what those networks are, and even within one particular group, there will be differences. So some people will want to involve parents and extended family and parents-in-law, and other people would say, actually, I'd rather not have that involvement of other people. And so this is where those power differences can be useful, because a doctor can come in and say, actually, we need to have this conversation in private, but only if that's what your patient has said. And co-production is at its heart an individualized and personalized way of service delivery. That's why it takes more time. It's not necessarily more expensive, but it is more time expensive. So it's about taking that approach.
Thank you very much. The next question is for, again, now I'm looked at the question carefully. It was in two parts, but for Dr. Adeline, you've mentioned the role of patients from the sheer aspect that our genomic makeup and also our environmental makeup is not conversant with what's in Europe. How would you see the role in one particular aspect, which is about genomics, African patient engagement in rare diseases and disorders? Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, so thank you for that question. Really, I think, in terms of genomics, we have a very heterogeneous population when it comes to Africa, and I think we're the most heterogeneous population globally, really. I think for us in Sub-Saharan Africa, when we talk about rare diseases, there's a lot of focus on the unmet needs and the huge burden of disease that we're seeing, like I alluded to earlier before, I mean, in non-communicable diseases. So I think, in prioritizing what the needs are for Sub-Saharan Africa, I know prior to now, we've had a lot of focus on infectious diseases. There's a huge burden of disease with infectious diseases, most especially during the years of the HIV, and endemic on the continent. With lifestyles westernizing and people getting access to, changing their diets, we've seen a huge rise in the non-communicable diseases, a very huge rise there. And we expect this rise to continue, in the next couple of decades, right up until 2030, 2040. So really, this is where the focus is for, a lot of those companies that are actually going to start engaging in clinical trials on the continent. So while we say this is where the focus is for us in terms of, clinical trials, looking at non-communicable diseases, looking at oncology, looking at cardiovascular disease, looking at ophthalmology, we also are aware that, being part of low and middle income countries, that many of our patients simply do not have access to those medicines that are available for people with rare diseases on the continent. And our motto in Novartis is really, let's leave no patient behind. So really, if we're looking at those patients that have, some of these rare diseases, in that context of let's leave no patient behind, we also want to make those, clinical trials, for those products available, within the continent. But I think it's a gradual process. It's not something that we will embark on and get there in the next 5 years. I think it's, the process of building is very gradual. So we hope to ramp up, build capability, build capacity, those trial sites, get them, get more clinical trial sites and more, healthcare professionals, investigators involved in clinical trials. So it's a journey. That's what we're embarking on in Sub-Saharan Africa. So, we do have areas of focus that we're looking at, but we also say in our quest to leave nobody behind, no patient behind, that we will look and, expand, our reach and our focus to include those areas that typically may not be so common, but we also know that, we still have those patients that have, that are suffering from these diseases. So yeah, so I'm hoping that answers the question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that's done very well. Thank you both speakers and also Dr. Miriam, who couldn't join us because of pressures at the academic front, I think. So also we have got Eid al-Adha in Africa, and so in a hospital that has the Aga Khan. I think they'll be making, I was born there, by the way, so I know the nature of celebration there. It's amazing. So today, to anybody who's born there today, great joy to you. And thank you everybody for your participation.